They are the children of the sky, for they were born from her breath, moulded of gusts sent swirling atop the throat of the world. They are the sons and daughters of Kine, tall and fair-haired, unbitten by frost and unfettered in conquest. The Nords are one of the most historically important races to have ever set foot upon Tamriel. Without their arrival, it is possible that elven hegemony would have proceeded unbridled in reign. Many could argue that without the expansion of the Nordic kingdoms in what is now called High Rock, Morrowind, and Northern Cyrodiil, and without the assistance of the Nordic armies during the Alessian Rebellion, the Aelid kingdoms may have remained absolute, and with a Cyrodiilic empire never born, the formation of the Eight Divines never established, who knows what other fate would have become the races of man. Today, Skyrim is home of all true Nords, yet centuries upon centuries of cultural marriage and imperial influence have culminated in the contemporary Nordic culture that praises southern deities, a culture that spills blood over the right to worship Talos, the founder god of the Septim Empire. However, in the cracks and creases of Skyrim's ancient geography, there remains echoes of time-worn traditions, songs of old kind, and stone-faced monoliths that lay bare an older, weirder culture. The Nords you know today are not the same as those of the bygone eras. Nordic culture has indelible scrolls of the weird and profound in its storied history. Contradictory and respoken, sung in slipped vowels from bard to scholar, painted and sculpted by the hands of foreign admirers trying to make sense of past glories. Skyrim is much weirder than you think. Follow me on this journey as far back as we can gleam, and together we will discover the stranger parts of Skyrim's lore. But before we dive further into just how weird Skyrim really is, I want to let you know that we've been fortunate enough to have a sponsor for this video, a game with over 800 champions to unlock and tons of awesome bosses to test them against with new updates every single month. This is Raid Shadow Legends, an RPG you can download on mobile and PC, and right now they have some big news that you don't want to miss. The world of Raid Shadow Legends and Monster Hunter are colliding in an amazing limited time crossover. Starting on January 9th, 2024 and finishing on March 5th, players can collect 5 Monster Hunter themed legendary champions based on iconic monsters from Capcom's action RPG franchise: Rathalos, Zinogre, Elatrion, Fatalis, and Ruiner Nergigante. Everyone can get the Rathalos Blademaster legendary champion for free simply by logging into Raid for 7 days between now and March 5th. The game features a campaign mode, which is great for leveling your champions and testing different team strategies, which is my favorite aspect of the game. There is also a dungeon mode full of deadly bosses, faction wars, a PvP arena, and the clan bosses mode. And now there's a brand new rarity above legendary: mythical. Mythical champions have a special new mechanic called Metamorph, allowing them to change between 2 different forms. They emerge from their metamorphosis with new skills and a new look, allowing you to make synergistic playstyles across both of their forms. With all of this exciting stuff and more coming to Raid, what are you waiting for? Click our link in the description or scan the QR code on screen and you'll get some great bonuses. We are talking an epic champion Drake from the Lisbon faction and some other useful things. Additionally, once you're in game, use the promo code RAIDXmas for new and old players. When you're in and crushing your enemies, you'll probably want to join a clan. You'll need your friends' usernames, and you can find mine as Fudgekiller. So just hit my link in the description and I'll see you on the battlefield. While speaking of sponsorship, I'd also like to shout out a story I wrote last year set in the Elder Scrolls universe. It is the story of the rise of Emperor Riemann, told in the fashion of Arthurian legend. I'm blown away by the feedback, and it's a true passion piece of mine, so please do check it out after the video. But now enough of that talk, let's journey back as far as we can, back into the realms where myth meets reality. Elder Scrolls lore is as vast as it is contradictory. The lines between myth and history ever blur, and even the Elder Scrolls themselves, tools of divine prophecy and insight, are ever shifting in content. What remains even more difficult in the case of the Nords is that most of their tales have been passed from tongue to ear, contradictory and reassembled in oral retellings through millennia of bardic traditions. It was the legendary king Ysgramor who developed a runic alphabet based on elvish principles, which enabled the written transcription of Atmoran speech. Ysgramor's first work in this new form of writing was a chronicle of his own life and its events, making Ysgramor the first human historian. To think that before Ysgramor of the late Merethic era, there is a history of Atmora largely unknown and untold of. Atmora is undoubtedly the homeland of the Nords, an icy northland growing colder and more uninhabitable with the passage of time. But in times past, it was greener, cold, but accommodating, a land of forests and running streams. After all, the very name Atmora translates to elder wood. But you may find that claim strange, that Nords were breathed onto the throat of the world in Skyrim, but simultaneously hail from Atmora. If we were to believe other legends, and particularly the idea that all the land masses were once whole, as Old Maris, then it is possible that Kine breathed the Nords into life atop the throat of the world, and they fought against the elves in the Elnafey War, conquering Atmora, but in the aftermath of the Sundering, when the continents were broken apart, they were perhaps stuck on the side of Atmora, and so Ysgramor's famous return may have a double meaning, and the Nordic claim to Skyrim as a homeland may, in some sense, be true. What makes me consider the stories of their creation and connection with Kine is undoubtedly their very physicality. The book The Children of the Sky says, "The further north you go into Skyrim, the more powerful and elemental the people become, and the less they require dwellings and shelters. Wind is fundamental to Skyrim, and the Nords, those that live in the far wastes, always carry a wind with them." In-game, this has been represented by certain elemental resistances. As of the 4th era, Nords have a 50% frost resistance in-game, but in previous incarnations, as is the case with the 3rd era Nords of the Elder Scrolls III Morrowind, Nords had a complete immunity to frost, a 100% resistance, and they had a 50% resistance to shock. Basically, they were resistant to all the elements that they would encounter in their frigid home. And personally, I think this is a far better execution of gameplay statistics as a representation of the lore, and interestingly, they also had the power Thunderfist, which does 25 points of frost damage on touch, and the power Woad, which shields them for 30 points. And for those who don't know, Woad is a blue pigment that is used in the creation of blue paint, the very same that these barbaric fellows adorn themselves in. It's a cool idea that the Nords, charging in, bare-chested and free of frostbite, need no armor because the magical woad painted on their body shall protect them. Perhaps it is the case that this woad is magically enchanted by the clever men of old, or the court wizards of the current day. But perhaps it is even possible that in some sense, the woad works for protection because they simply believe and repeat that it does. We will speak of the Thum and the tongues in time, but in brief words, many ancient Nords had the power of the voice, the ability to shape reality and perform amazing feats by the words of their mouth, shouting down walls, breathing ice, calling down storms. You know of this, the dragon language. Is it too far-fetched to say that the power of their woad works in the same capacity because it has been reinforced for thousands of years in words spoken by tongues that have shaped the nature of the paint? Maybe that is far-fetched, but it is an interesting idea in this universe of belief-driven mythopoeia. Despite the imperialized Nords of the 4th era, the Nords of old seemed far weirder and interesting. The Children of the Sky says, "The breath and the voice are the vital essence of a Nord. When they defeat great enemies, they take their tongues as trophies. These are woven into ropes and can hold speech like an enchantment." A gnarly sight to be sure. Imagine what the victims of their conquests must have seen. Hordes of bare-skinned axemen with the pelts of bears draped atop their head, their bodies painted in protective woad as they charge headlong into arrow fire, screaming and shouting walls down with their powerful voices, led by ancient kings in armors of enchanted ice, Stalrim. I am personally fascinated by the ancient history of Tamriel, and arguably it is the Nords that changed the course of it. Let us return to the first human historian, the genocidal elf slayer Ysgramor, the harbinger of us all. He was among the first Atmoran settlers that came to Skyrim, and if Atmoran migratory theories are to be believed, he was among the last of many migrations. I have my own thoughts about Nordic origins divorced from the Atmoran fatherland explanation, but to avoid digressing, you can watch this video later on for more info. Regardless, a written history of Nordic origin begins with Ysgramor, and I would argue that the history of Skyrim as it is today begins with he and his infamous 500 companions. As a small note for transparency, I'm using the word Nordic, which in the context of the time that we are speaking about would be considered anachronistic, as they would have most certainly considered themselves of Atmoran cultural identity. It was not until the reign of King Harald, the 13th of Ysgramor's dynasty, that all Atmoran holdings would be relinquished, and the Nordic identity of Skyrim began to emerge independently, and some sources indicate that the Nords only began to call themselves as such sometime after Yakutan arrival on Tamriel, which would mean that the Nordic identity as a concept distinguished from Atmoran only began to emerge at the earliest during the 9th century of the First Era. It could have been even later, could have been earlier if that source is wrong, but regardless of exactly when, I just thought I should point that out when speaking of the Nords, of the Merethic and early First Eras. They likely did not consider themselves as such, but I will continue to simply refer to the culture as Nordic for ease of language. So Ysgramor was an ancient Atmoran hero who led a great colonizing feat to Tamriel, landing at Sarek Head at the extreme northern tip of Skyrim's Broken Cape. Nearby, the first Nordic settlement of Saarthal was founded, and they cohabited peacefully with the native snow elves at this time. However, as you can probably imagine, tensions arose. The infamous Night of Tears occurred, and the elves slaughtered the entire city. Only Ysgramor and his two sons, Ingol and Ilgar, escaped the massacre. For what reasons the Night of Tears took place is unknown in complete truth. Some say the Nords were partaking in intolerable blasphemies. Other sources say that the Nords had found something when they built their city, buried deep in the ground. They attempted to keep it buried, but the elves learned of it and coveted it for themselves. The scholar Dranor Seloth believes that Ysgramor knew something of what the elves would find under Saarthal and rallied together his people to keep the elves from gaining it. When Nords once again controlled Skyrim, this power was buried deep below the earth and sealed away. Whether or not this was the impetus for Ysgramor's return, or whether it was to be a reprisal set to be avenged tenfold, Ysgramor came back all the same, wielding the legendary axe Wuthrad and with 500 Atmoran companions at his side. The legendary Songs of Return are famous for their tales of epic conquest, strength, courage, and honor, and in a tradition upheld by the companions of today, Ysgramor is the exemplar of the Nordic spirit, which all Nords would strive to emulate. But what if Ysgramor was not just one man? What if he wasn't a man at all? There are many a theory about the true nature of Ysgramor, and we have lots to discuss, but to preface, I think laying out the framework of Nordic thought when regarding their history is very important, as well as emphasizing the importance of stories and the power of myth within the very fabric of Mundus. If you've been into the Elder Scrolls for a while, you may have well heard of the name Michael Kirkbride. He was a former developer at Bethesda that was pivotal in the world building and design of the Elder Scrolls III Morrowind, which laid the foundations for the lore that we know and love. At the time, it was a sort of soft reboot for the series. Now, infamously, he wrote the 36 Lessons of Vivec, and he introduced the ideas of Coda to the Elder Scrolls. He also wrote many texts after his time at Bethesda, which have been collected on the Imperial Library website. In that time, many were dissatisfied with the more generic fantasy execution of the Elder Scrolls IV Oblivion compared to the uniquely alien and fantastical setting of Morrowind, which itself was based on a Tamriel described in the Pocket Guide to the Empire 1st edition, which came with the physical release of the Elder Scrolls Adventures Redguard in 1998. On the Elder Scrolls Lore website, the Imperial Library, there is fragments of a fan-made Pocket Guide to the Empire 2nd edition that was worked on by several die-hard fans of the series and Michael Kirkbride, and in particular, it is relevant to our topic today. Michael Kirkbride wrote this segment about Nordic thought, which while not strictly seal of authority canon, in the corporate sense of the word, it remains a valid interpretation of Nordic thought, especially because it does align with canonical elements of their stories and culture. It says, "Let us just say here that Nordic faith is complicated. It is decentralized by the inevitable embellishment and narrative entanglement of millennia of oral tradition. Most Nordic myths contradict each other, using anachronisms or elements co-opted from other cultures or repeat themselves under different guises. Sometimes they do all of this, and purposefully so. Indeed, the Nords freely admit their mythic haberdashery and take great delight in mishmashing their legends together and the legends of others, even their historic enemies, the Aldmer and the Ysmir, into whatever just tells a good story at feast time. As their clever men are fond of saying, the snows melt and then freeze again, and in the end it is all still so much water. Legends are the same. It is an interesting frame of reference, one that places importance on the narrative quality of a story over its verified accuracy. After all, if a myth or legend's purpose is to teach lessons, promote unity, or inspire, does it really matter if it's entirely accurate? Would it not be best if it were perhaps more contextual and resonant with the listener? This is simply folklore and how it emerges, whether it be Hansel and Gretel, don't trust strangers offering things too good to be true, or rather the Nords believing that snow elves still lurk in the corners of Skyrim and kidnap children, perhaps a lesson to children to not wander off alone, or a general sentiment to never trust an elf. Folklore stories often serve practical lessons, and narrative is one of the best teachers available to the mind. Remember also that even upon Earth, the obsession and the tools to acquire such rigorous attempted unbiased documentation is incredibly difficult, and many times in the past probably not in the best interests of the reigning culture at the time, as it could undermine their control. So to the mead-swilling, bard-singing and axe-swinging barbarians of the far north, a historical record of arduous details and actuallys may not be broadly considered to be something of value. Another key word in the Pocket Guide quote is decentralization, the Nords not having a centralized faith with an archprimate or another pope-like figure. Variations in geography, the effects of foreign borders, and appropriated customs are palpable, with the largest historical divide existing between the East and West, but undoubtedly also between the North and South, for the Near-Clovian Nords of Falkreath would be considered quite distinct from the Nords of Dawnstar or Winterhold. It is helpful also to understand a pagan mind, one that could potentially understand the existence of other gods of other cultures, of other lands, as opposed to the more centralized, mutually exclusive faiths predominant in the last 2,000 years of Earth. Even at times in our own history, for instance in Rome, local gods and traditions from across their empire would be adopted and sometimes grow quite popular. Similar examples in the Nordic Pantheon could be that of Orki, a strange god that seems to combine aspects of both the Daedric prince Malakath and the Aedric divine known as Arkay. The Varieties of Faith book says this: "He is a lone god for the Nords, who seem to have taken up his worship during Aldmeri rule of Atmora. Nords believe they once lived as long as the elves until Orki appeared. Through heathen trickery he fooled them into a bargain that bound them to the Count of Winters. At one time, legends say, Nords only had a lifespan of 6 years due to Orki's foul magic. Then Shor showed up and through unknown means removed the curse, throwing most of it onto the nearby orcs." It is also important to understand the difference of orthodoxy, a focus on correct belief and faith, and orthopraxy, focus on correct action and behavior. Religion usually consists of elements of both, but largely is dominated by one or the other. I think it would be fair to describe most of history's pagans as largely orthopraxical in nature, with an emphasis on performing the correct rituals and observing the rites demanded by the gods. To loop all this back to the Elder Scrolls, it may be far more important to the Nords that one behaves and acts like a true Nord and earns entry into Sovngarde having borne attributes of valor, honor, and bravery. However, whether they believe that X hero or X god did this thing at this time may largely be irrelevant to them, as long as it encourages right action. Whereas in Orthodox religion, many a war and conflict has been fought over the written word and its interpretations, whether X is heresy or whether Y is the Messiah or not, so on and so forth. So, with that whole exhaustive tangent ticked off the list, let's circle on back to what kickstarted this diatribe. Ysgramor. The most conventional and popular understanding is that he was an Atmoran king fleeing civil war, one guy that kickstarted the conquest of Skyrim and his dynasty ruled for centuries. However, if we look at Nordic thought as a mythical haberdashery of whatever is the best tale, it is entirely possible that Ysgramor and all his heroic, oft-times mythic feats are in fact a collection of stories which could be perhaps attributed to several kings of his early dynasty. Remember, while he is considered the first human historian, this is still the late Merethic era and pre-Dragon Wars, and documentation from this time is scarce. The dynasty of Ysgramor would not enter into the existed dated records until King Harold was born in the 113th year of the First Era, and he was supposed to be the 13th in the line of Ysgramor. Assuming in 100 years there is 4 to 5 generations, and considering King Harold lived to the age of 108, let us assume 4 generations per century, this would place 8 kings in the line of Ysgramor before the First Era. So that places Ysgramor 200 years before the start of the First Era, but that conflicts somewhat with Kodlak Whitemane, who says the Companions, founded by Ysgramor, are nearly 5,000 years old, which would place Ysgramor around 500 years before the start of the First Era. There is inconsistency, and to believe that the narrative around Ysgramor has not changed in thousands of years is probably unwise. There are also theories that claim Ysgramor and his 500 companions were actually dragons, which would explain how they were able to devastate an entire kingdom of snow elves, and of course why Skyrim's initial culture was so heavily dragon-focused of all the animal totems at the outset. We've covered this insane theory on the channel, and I will also link that for later, but regardless, with an understanding of Nordic thought, it is easier to understand or perhaps even doubt their long-winded histories. But let us enter the realm of possibilities and try and understand the mythic, not even of Shor and the Nordic Pantheon still proud in the Second and Third eras, but rather let us go back to the days of the dragon cult and before, of the totems from which the Nordic Pantheon emerged. It all began on Atmoran, where it is believed that the Atmorans of those days worshipped the animal totems. After all, it is the culture that was imported wholesale to Skyrim when Ysgramor and his 500 made the return. You would have seen dedications to the animal totems all throughout the ancient Nordic ruins and their future anthropomorphized forms as the Nordic Pantheon, Shor, Kine, and the like. Of course, the dragon cult became the strongest and most dominant factor of ancient Nordic religion, but that abruptly ended with the Dragon War and the casting of Alduin into a future time. But aside from the dragon, who is most clearly related to Alduin, the World Eater, there is the hawk, she-wolf, snake, moth, owl, whale, bear, and fox. The book Divines and the Nords says, eventually the animal totem gods transformed into the 8 gods we worship today. We call them by their true names, Alduin, Kine, Mara, Dibella, Stun, Drunal, Orki, and Shor. We understand that our gods are as cyclical as the world itself, so we also remember the dead gods, Shor and Sun, who fought and died to bring about the current world. The hearth gods, Kine, Mara, Dibella, Stun, and Drunal, who watch over the present cycle, and the twilight god, Alduin, who ushers in the next cycle. Add to these our so-called testing gods, who we do not worship but instead guard against to protect the hearth. These include Orki, Morlock, and Hermamora. What's cool about this book is that it's ratifying lore written by Michael Kirkbride outside of a development capacity on the Imperial Library. You can find this text, the Nords' Totemic Religion, and it says very similar things. At the end, there is an additional note on the Nordic view of Imperial religion that reads the following. The 8 divines are viewed by the Nords as a southern import. They retain some of the taint of the Alessian order and are basically viewed as a religion for foreigners. Their gods are fine for them, but Nords need Nord gods. Some of the gods are the same or similar. Significantly, these are the 3 female gods, which are far more important to the Nords than they are in the Imperial cult. Kine is in fact the de facto head of the Nord Pantheon. The Nords are perplexed and disturbed by the Imperial cult's focus on the dragon god. They regard this as a fundamental misunderstanding of the universe, and one likely to cause disaster in the end, which fits perfectly with the pessimistic Nord view of the world in general. Things are likely to turn out badly, and it will probably be caused by some foreigner. Lucky for the world that the Nords are so diligent about keeping Alduin asleep, while the Southerners are busy trying to get his attention. Any mention of Akatosh in a Nord's presence is likely to bring a muttered invocation to Alduin to stay asleep in response. Now, the canon book, Divines and the Nords, also says something very similar. Probably our biggest difference relates to the head of the pantheon. We Nords consider Kain as the leader of the gods and find the imperial fascination with Alduin, who they call Akatosh, to be both perplexing and mildly disturbing. We work diligently to keep Alduin asleep, while our southern neighbours try time and time again to get his attention, which is why I begin every service in the temple with a prayer to praise Alduin, O great god of time, followed by a prayer to keep him at bay. May your slumber stretch on for 1,000 generations. So it is well known that the original Atmoran animal totems are earlier versions of the Nordic pantheon of divines, Kain, Dibella, Drunal, and the like. But I think there is more to speculate upon here. Let us look to one of the earliest offshoots of Nordic culture, one who in isolation has perhaps preserved some of the Atmoran religion wholesale, without later development through imperial influences. The Skaal are an animist people on the island of Solstheim, a people who believe in the living souls of all things in creation, who find their source in the All-Maker. Totem stones and spirits of the land are important to them. However, they are a people descended from Nords who inhabited the land during the time of dragon domination in the Merethic era. Their people still have tales of an ancient dragon priest ruler of Solstheim who defeated Mirak the traitor. Legend has it that Solstheim was once connected to Skyrim, and it was the battle between Varlock and Mirak that severed it from the mainland. Irrespective of legend, the Skaal people clearly have a shared lineage with these ancient Nords, and this inclines me to believe that in the time of Ysgramor and the subsequent line of kings that would have been under the thumb of the dragons until their liberation were still worshipping animal totems in a different capacity to the Nordic pantheon of today, and were perhaps far closer to the Skaal religion and Atmoran faith. Remember, anachronisms were far more common before ages of widespread formalized education, before robust archaeology and unprejudiced historical record. We often impart our own biases and ways of thought onto people of old, and with a culture that revels in a bardic tradition, embellishing a story to make it the most epic tale possible to an audience of merry mead-drinking Nords, it would not be far-fetched to believe that any references of Ysgramor and Shorin connection, for example, were made later in order to make it contextual for a contemporary Nordic audience who worships such beings by such names, whereas it is possible that Ysgramor and the Atmorans of that time would have known him by the totem of the fox alone, or perhaps some other lost name. Let's keep on track and look at the Skaal as a theoretical isolate of ancient Nordic belief, and then go through a sequence of steps to see how the traditional Nordic pantheon of Kain, Shor, and the like emerged. The Skaal are animistic, meaning a belief in the soul of all things, whether that be stones, mountains, seas, plants, and animals, and all natural phenomena. All finds their source within the All-Maker. While I've seen around the idea that the All-Maker corresponds with the equivalent of Anu, the primordial force of order, I believe this is an incorrect read. I expand on this idea more in this video, The Misunderstood God, which I'll link below, but considering the origins of Skaal belief being Nordic, or rather Atmoran, and that the Skaal worship the All-Maker as the creator of Mundus, aka the mortal world that they live in, I am inclined to believe that the All-Maker is the embodiment of Padme and Lorcan, or rather Shor, who across pretty much every myth upon Tamriel is credited as the creator of Mundus, whether that be the elven belief that Lorcan tricked the other gods and created the mortal world as a prison barring them from Aetherios, or rather the typically human Padmaic beliefs where the mortal world was created out of love or trial for enlightenment. Either way, the Padmaic force, Lorcan, Shor, Shazar, whatever name it goes by, is the creator. And since the Skaal are an offshoot of the Nords, I would think that the All-Maker is the equivalent of the Padmaic, the essential force of differentiation and mortality, of limitation, as opposed to what the Skaal call the adversary, which I would say is their version of Anu, the force of stasis and the infinite. Also consider that what the Skaal call Thartag the World Devourer, aka Alduin the World Eater, is seen as an aspect of the adversary, aka Anu, Auriel, Akatosh, etc. Check out the video linked below for a more extensive explanation, but having said all this, I think that perhaps the ancient Nords also believed in an All-Maker type deity from which all creation flows, and then perhaps later certain animal totems were emphasized over the others. Consider that the Skaal also believe in reincarnation. Storn Cragstrider, shaman of the Skaal village in the year 201 of the 4th era, says, "The All-Maker is the maker of all things, and it is from the All-Maker that life flows like a great river. As all rivers must return to the sea, so all life returns in time to the All-Maker." The book, The Children of the All-Maker, says, "For the Skaal, the All-Maker is the source of all life and creation. When a creature dies, its spirit returns to the All-Maker, who shapes it into something new and returns it to Mundus. The concept of death as an ending to life is unknown to the Skaal. Rather, death is seen as simply the beginning of the next stage of an endless journey." The concepts of reincarnation and the endless journey of the soul is not unlike the Nordic beliefs of Kalpic cycles, where Alduin will awake and consume the world, only for it to begin again at the dawn, where Shor will fight the elven gods once more as he has uncountable times before. It is hard to say with any certainty what the exact beliefs and names of the Nordic Pantheon were in those early days, but we can pinpoint some fundamental spots where the Nordic Pantheon possibly emerged as it was for most of history, bar the recent imperialization of the Fourth Era. As I said before, the solidly recorded and dated history of the Nordic Kingdom of Skyrim begins with King Harald XIII of Ysgramor's dynasty. Year 140 of the First Era, King Harald with his army breached Fallhost, the last stronghold of the dragon cult, consolidating Skyrim under a single rule. All holdings in Atmoran are relinquished and Skyrim is made an independent kingdom with Windhelm as its capital, and the Moot of the Nords is established to help usher in successive kings. This is really the origin of Skyrim as we know it. I would be willing to believe that at this time, and in the centuries beforehand, the transition from the animal totems into the more anthropomorphized versions began. The fox becoming recognized as Shor, the bear as Sun, the hawk as Kine, the wolf as Mara, the moth as Debella, the snake as Orki, the owl as Junal, and of course the dragon as Alduin, who, considering the recent annihilation of the dragon cult, would have been firmly placed as an antagonistic element of their pantheon. This is at least my attempt at understanding its development. We should also note that with the role of Kine, who through Paarthurnax taught the Nords the dragon tongue so that they may liberate themselves from Alduin's oppression, that this may be where Kine's status was elevated and emphasized as de facto head of their pantheon, and it is in the aftermath of the Dragon War that the Nordic tongues would emerge into legend, with abilities of the Thumb that would no doubt be instrumental in their future successes. Let me read you this passage from the First Pocket Guide to the Empire. "Through the use of the voice, the vital power of a Nord can be articulated into a thum, or shout. Shouts can be used to sharpen blades, or to strike enemies at a distance. Masters of the voice are known as tongues, and their power is legendary. They can call to specific people over hundreds of miles, and they can move by casting a shout, appearing where it lands. The most powerful tongues cannot speak without causing destruction. They must go gagged, and communicate through a sign language and through scribing runes. In the days of the conquest of Morrowind and the founding of the First Empire, the great Nord war chiefs, Derek the Tall, Jorg Helmbolg, Hogue Mercula, were all tongues. When they attacked a city, they needed no siege engines. The tongues would form up in a wedge in front of the gatehouse and draw in breath. When the leader let it out in a thum, the doors were blown in, and the axemen rushed into the city. Such were the men that forged the First Empire." What First Empire, you may ask? Well, it was King Harald's second son, Vraga the Gifted, who succeeded his elder brother Hjalmar's brief reign that oversaw the height of Skyrim's legacy. High King Vraga's reign saw the expansion of Nordic domain into High Rock, Morrowind, and northern Cyrodiil, and famously, his Nordic armies came to the assistance of the Alessian rebellion, pivotal in the overthrowing of the Aelid regime and the establishment of a human power in Cyrodiil. It was for this reason that Alesia formed the Eight Divines, a syncretic pantheon of Nordic and Aldmeri deities. It is why we have Akatosh as a dragon time god as opposed to Auriel, the elven king time god, or why we have Shizar, the spirit of human undertaking, as opposed to Shor, the chieftain war god enemy of elves. Many Nords in this time settled Cyrodiil and intermixed with the Nedic populations, and famously, many such Nords with frontier spirits ventured into the western lands of Cyrodiil that would later become known as Clovia, hence the Nordic influences found throughout Clovian culture. While many Nords did so and became the Cyro-Nordics, taking on worship of the Alessian-formed Eight Divines, the quote-unquote true Nords of Skyrim remained steadfast in their Nordic pantheon, that is, until the reign of King Borgas. If you watched our video about how the Empire is weirder than you think, link below, you would be familiar with the Alessian Order, a zealous theocratic tyranny that emerged in the years following Empress Alessia's death. The Alessian doctrines were enforced just shy of a century afterward, and the Cyrodiilic Empire of this time was profoundly different to the one you would be familiar with. They worshipped a deity known as the One, and it was a faith that was staunchly anti-Elven. Meanwhile, in Skyrim, High King Borgas of the line of Ysgramor ruled, and he converted to the Alessian faith and forced Skyrim to do the same, the Nordic faith lasting in hushed words and secret tellings beneath the oversight of the Alessian Order. It was a dark time for Skyrim, and King Borgas in his zealotry went to Cyrodiil to urge a joint war against the Bosmer-Cameron dynasty. But year 369 of the First Era, the Bosmer enacted the Wild Hunt, a collective ritual of the Bosmer where they shapeshift into a horde of feral eldritch beasts, and they found and slaughtered him. When Borgas died, so did Ysgramor's dynasty. The Moot failed to elect a new king, and a brutal war of succession took place for many decades. Skyrim's former territories in High Rock and Morrowind were lost, and it was not until the year 420 of the First Era that the War of Succession of Skyrim would end with the Pact of Chieftains, with Olaf One-Eye crowned as High King of Skyrim. You surely would have heard of Olaf One-Eye and his famous feats. You know of Dragon's Reach in Whiterun, and the skull of the dragon that hangs atop the throne? Let me tell you the tale of Olaf and the dragon. Long ago in the First Age, a fearsome dragon named Numinex ravaged the whole of Skyrim. The dreadful drake wiped out entire villages, burned cities, and killed countless Nords. It seemed that no power in Tamriel could stop the monster. This was a troubled time in Skyrim's history, for a bitter war of succession raged between the holds. The Jarls might have been able to conquer the beast if they had worked together, but trust was in desperately short supply. A skillful warrior named Olaf came forward and promised to defeat the beast. In some accounts, he is the Jarl of Whiterun. In other versions of the legend, Olaf promises the people of Whiterun that he will capture the monster if they will name him Jarl. At any rate, Olaf ventures forth with a handful of his most trusted warriors and seeks the beast out, eventually finding Numinex in his lair atop Mount Anthor. Needless to say, it is an epic battle. First, Olaf comes at the dragon with his axe and his shield. Some variants of the legend say that Olaf and the beast battled with blade and claw for days, but were too evenly matched for either to gain an advantage. Most accounts hold that Olaf, perhaps frustrated that his weapons are completely ineffectual against the dragon, finally casts them aside, giving voice to a rage that has been building within him. Olaf unleashes a terrible shout. Here again, the stories diverge. Many accounts hold that Olaf did not realize he possessed the power of dragon speech, while others suggest he had long possessed this gift, but wished to test himself against the dragon in martial combat first. Virtually all variations of the legend, however, agree on what happened next. Using the awesome powers of the dragon language, Numinex and Olaf engage in an epic shouting duel atop Mount Anthor. So forceful are their words, they are said to shatter the stone and split the sky. Finally, Numinex collapses from a combination of injury and sheer exhaustion. Somehow, and this detail is conspicuously absent in virtually every account, Olaf manages to convey the dragon all the way back to the capital city of Whiterun. The people of Whiterun are suitably impressed with Olaf's hostage. They build a huge stone holding cell at the rear of the palace, which they rename Dragon's Reach. This enormous cell serves as Numinex's prison until his death. Olaf himself eventually becomes High King of Skyrim, putting an end to the War of Succession. Presumably his great deed made him the only leader upon whom all the people could agree, and so the land, once again, has peace. But famously, on the contrary, there are written fragments of the songs of the bard Svafnir, which tell of a less flattering tale. These tomes suggest that Numinex was particularly foul-tempered because he was extremely old. In these accounts, the dragon spends his final years terrorizing the countryside before flying off to the top of Mount Anthor to die in peace. When Olaf finds Numinex, the dragon is too weak to defend himself. Olaf and his men capture the beast without effort, but decide to take advantage of the situation by fabricating a heroic tale. It is worth noting that of all Olaf's warriors who were said to witness the shout duel, went on to become wealthy leaders during Olaf's reign as High King. However, it is equally likely that Svafnir had some grudge against Olaf, and his scandalous verse was an attempt to damage the High King's reputation. Considering that in this age there were many powerful tongues, I am willing to believe that King Olaf was but one of them, especially if he were to become High King following the War of Succession. But let us move on from Olaf One-Eye, who inherited Skyrim in its most downtrodden state. The shadow of the Alessian doctrines enforced and propagated by King Borgas' reign, as well as decades of civil war, had affected Skyrim's faith in a major way. While we cannot say for certain how resilient faith in the Nordic Pantheon remained, what we do know for certain is that it was during the reign of King Wulfarth, 60 years after the War of Succession ended, that the worship of the Nordic Pantheon was formally reinstated as the faith of Skyrim. Now, before we speak at length about Wulfarth and other famous tongues of great power and renown, I wanted to make this small mention of snow whales. Full disclosure, I couldn't find a nice spot to cleanly segue into this little spiel about snow whales, so I decided to break up the historical talk with some fun bit of Skyrim's weirdness. The only canon mention of a snow whale that I'm aware of is from Vigwin Alwatcher, a Nord alchemist who says, "Most people laugh when I tell them about the snow whales of Skyrim and their cousins in elsewhere. You can only spot them while under the influence of my special concoction." So, if that was all we have to go off, then it may seem that she is just a crazy woman experimenting with psychedelic potions. However, Michael Kirkbride has written a text called The Seven Fights of the Elder Dagger. The third fight is called The Snow Whale and the Dirtbird. It says, "Snow whales have been in Skyrim since the return of man, living at the tops of the highest mountains, singing in magic tones, jumping from peak to cloud and back again, spreading their joy snow in horn-like triumph from blowholes. We used to hunt them, our best climbers braving the rocks and ice sheets, carrying rope and hooked spears. They had much meat, these whales, and blubber, and fluids that made paint and rosewater for our women. The earliest hunters had no luck. Spouts of joy snow from the whales above would drift down from the clouds and turn the men goofy." Kirkbride responded in a Reddit thread about this very piece what joy snow is, and his idea was that it is basically cocaine. So, knowing that, we have Nord hunters that would get hit by spouts of falling cocaine and then turn goofy and be unable to hunt. The story continues. "They would laugh like happy babes, some getting so tickled that they'd roll back down the mountainside in big flumps, which only begat more guffaws, or begin to pat each other on the back or hug in the masculine style to reaffirm their affections and camaraderie. In essence, the joy snow got in their heads and they just forgot what they were doing. Eventually, Huggart the Wrinkled, onto Unreadable, one of our clever men, made sure that the hunters remembered to occasionally hit one another out of the blue, or make lewd jokes of their respective wives or mothers or sons that had not yet shown promise, and steal and hide the shoes of their fellows, and to line the rims of their shields with wasabi, so that when they bit them, they might ignore all happiness in fits of burning nose and choked throat. All of these measures availed them not, for the potency of the joy snow of the snow whales remained unhindered by any attempt at anger, and its powder would inevitably reduce our hunters again to snickering children, who when they saw themselves so war-laden in this state, made them chortle and jest all the more. Lesson learned, we left the snow whales alone." So regardless of the validity of this work, it's a very interesting take that describes a part of Nordic culture not seen in the games. Also, the concept of snow whales exists within Michael Kirkbride's work that was later added into this one canon mention in the Elder Scrolls Online. I like to think of this as lore of an ancient time no longer seen. Either way, it's a fun bit of weird lore, which I wish the series would embrace more of in its modern incarnations. Now, back to the king. High King Wulfarth is one of the most important figures of history where record meets legend. Some say he was Dragonborn, one of the most powerful tongues to ever exist. The 5 songs of King Wulfarth say, "After the defeat of the Alessian army at Glenumbria Moors, where King Hogmercula was slain, Wulfarth of Atmoran was elected by the Pact of Chieftains. His thumb was so powerful that he could not verbally swear into office, and scribes were used to draw up his oaths. Immediately thereafter, the scribes wrote down the first new law of his reign, a fiery reinstatement of the traditional Nordic Pantheon. The edicts were outlawed, their priests put to the stake, and their halls set ablaze. The shadow of King Borgas had ended for a span. For his zealotry, King Wulfarth was called Shaw's Tongue, and Ysmir, Dragon of the North. The Nordic Pantheon was restored, but In what form? The Alessians were puritanical zealots set on destroying heresies wherever they lay, and perhaps this affected the Nordic Pantheon. Perhaps it could have changed or certain aspects of it lost, considering the Alessian taint had loomed for nearly 120 years, about 5 generations, and it is said that Wulfarth had to personally outlaw the Alessian edicts and hunt down the priesthood, which makes it sound as if the Alessian order was persistent in Skyrim for those 120 years. The reason I bring this up is because this is another possible inflection point where the Nordic Pantheon could have been affected and influenced, perhaps distancing further at this time from the associations with the Atmoran animal totems of old. Regardless, it was this moment with High King Wulfarth and his reinstatement of the Nordic Pantheon where Nordic faith enters its most recognizable form for the millennia to come. But I can't just name drop King Wulfarth and be done with it, because his legend is grand and his feats vital to the revival of a Nordic identity. Wulfarth's early life is little known about, aside from his birth upon the icy continent of Atmoran. He is also said to have been dragonborn and to have possessed one of the most powerful thumbs ever witnessed. He became High King year 480 of the First Era, according to the plaque in Windhelm. However, other records state that his predecessor, High King Mercular, was killed in the Battle of Glenumbria Bors, a battle that would occur 2 years later. Specific year aside, High King Wulfarth would ascend to the throne, reinstate the Nordic Pantheon, and take a zealous ire to all the enemies of Skyrim. Wulfarth's legend is known most through the 5 songs of King Wulfarth, which speak of his feats and heroism, and his tragedy also. Before we move to the songs, I wish to offer a different perspective, from a no less poetic but alien source, so that we may see how strange the Nordics may have seemed to those on the receiving ends of their axes. Sermon 9 of the 36 Lessons of Vivek describe the greatest of the demon chieftains from the frigid west of Skyrim. Hoarga, the mouth of mud, who appeared as a great bearded king, had the powers of marshalling and breathing the earth. On the battlefields, this demon would often be seen on the sidelines, eating the soil voraciously. When his men fell, Hoarga would fill their bodies back with it, whereupon they would rise again and fight, albeit slower. He had a secret name, Fenya, and destroyed 17 Chimeri villages and 2 Dwemer strongholds before being turned away. Do not forget that the 36 lessons are as dubious and mythical a source as any, but this may be referring to Wulfarth's predecessor, Mercular. Then again, it could be another Nordic chieftain entirely, clearly a powerful tongue. Next was Chemoa, the running hunger, who appeared as a mounted soldier with full helm, had the powers of heart-roaring and of sky-sickening. He ate the Chimeri hero, Dres Kizumet-E, sending the spirit back to the Hortator as an assassin. Sometimes called First Blighter, Chemoa could give Cloud stomach aches and turn the rain of Veloth into bile. He destroyed 6 Chimeri villages before he was slain by Vivek and the Hortator. Barg, the Two-Tongued, who appeared as a great bearded king, had the powers of surety and form change. His raiders were small in number, but ran amok in the west hinterlands, killing many Velothi trappers and scouts. He fell in a great debate with Vivek, for the warrior poet alone could understand the northern man's 2-layered speech, though Almsavy had to remain invisible during the argument. Then there was Barfok, Maid of Plains, who appeared as a winged human with lick-encrusted spear, had the powers of event denouement. Battles fought against her would always end in victory for Barfok because she could shape outcomes by singing. 4 Chimeri villages and 2 more Dwemer strongholds were destroyed by her decision enforcement. Vivek had to stuff her mouth with his milk finger to keep her from singing Veloth into ruin. Finally, there was Ysmir, the Dragon of the North, who always appears as a great bearded king, had powers of innumerable and echoing. He was grim and dark and the most silent of the invading chieftains, though when he spoke villages were uplifted and thrown into the sea. The Hortator fought him unarmed, grabbing the dragon's roars by the hand until Ysmir's power throat bled. These roars were given to Vivek to bind into an ebony listening frame which the warrior poet placed on Ysmir's face and ears to drive him mad and drive him away. It is plain to see the variety of power and the raw horror that the Nordic tongues of old could unleash upon their enemies, but let us return to the songs of Wulfarth, so we may better understand not only his legend but his importance for millennia to come, including in the formation of Talos. The second song of King Wulfarth glorifies his deeds in the eyes of the old gods. He fights the eastern orcs and shouts their chief into hell. He rebuilds the 418th step of High Hrothgar, which had been damaged by a dragon. When he swallowed a thundercloud to keep his army from catching cold, the Nords called him the Breath of Kine. The third song of Wulfarth tells of his death. Orki, an enemy god, had always tried to ruin the Nords, even in Atmoran where he stole their years away. Seeing the strength of King Wulfarth, Orki summoned the ghost of Alduin Time Eater again. Nearly every Nord was eaten down to 6 years old. Boy Wulfarth pleaded to Shor, the dead chieftain of the gods, to help his people. Shor's own ghost then fought the Time Eater on the spirit plane, as he did at the beginning of time. And he won, and Orki's folk, the orcs, were ruined. As Boy Wulfarth watched the battle in the sky, he learned a new thum. What happens when you shake the dragon just so? He used this new magic to change his people back to normal. In his haste to save so many, though, he shook too many years out on himself. He grew older than the greybeards and died. The flames of his pyre were said to have reached the hearth of Kine itself. From this passage, it seems Wulfarth's newly learned thum was some great form of time manipulation. The reference, what happens when you shake the dragon just so, is speaking of the concept of time. In the Elder Scrolls, the dragons and time are tightly related. Akatosh, Alkosh, Alduin, and so on are all associated with the structure of time. So with his thum, Wulfarth learnt to shake, in other words, grapple and manipulate time in just the right way with his new thum, so that he could return the Nords, who had been made children, back to adulthood. But he had died in the process, and according to historical record, it was cited to be year 533 by the Windhelm plaque. However, his story does not end here. The fourth song of King Wulfarth tells of his rebirth. The dwarves and devils of the eastern kingdoms had started to fight again, and the Nords hoped they might reclaim their ancient holdings there because of it. They planned an attack, but then gave up, knowing that they had no strong king to lead them. Then in walked the devil of Dagoth, who swore he came in peace. Moreover, he told the Nords of a wondrous thing. He knew where the heart of Shor was. Long ago, the chief of the gods had been killed by elven giants, and they ripped out Shor's heart and used it as a standard to strike fear into the Nords. This worked until Ysgramor shouted some sense, and the Nords fought back again. Knowing that they were going to lose eventually, the elven giants hid the heart of Shor so that the Nords might never have their god back. But here was the devil of Dagoth with good news. The dwarves and devils of the Eastern Kingdom had his heart, and this was the reason for their recent unrest. The Nords asked the devil of Dagoth why he might betray his countrymer so, and he said that the devils have betrayed each other since the beginning of time, and this was so, and so the Nords believed him. The tongue sung Shor's ghost into the world again. Shor gathered an army as he did of old, and then he sucked in the long-strewn ashes of King Wulfarth and remade him, for he needed a good general. But the devil of Dagoth petitioned to be that general too, and he pointed out his role as the blessed harbinger of this holy war. So Shor had 2 generals, the Ash King and the devil of Dagoth, and he marched on the eastern kingdoms with all the sons of Skyrim. Wulfarth was resurrected as the Ash King, and the song takes place during the War of the First Council, the war between the Dwemer and the Chimer, later to be changed to Dunmer, and its culmination in the Battle of Red Mountain. I will read the 5th song, but there are apocryphal hidden secret songs which contain other tellings. The 5th song of King Wulfarth is sad. The survivors of the disaster came back under a red sky. That year is called Sun's Death. The devil of Dagoth had tricked the Nords, for the heart of Shor was not in the eastern kingdoms and had never been there at all. As soon as Shor's army had got to Red Mountain, all the devils and dwarves fell upon them. Their sorcerers lifted the mountain and threw it onto Shor, trapping him underneath Red Mountain until the end of time. They slaughtered the sons of Skyrim, but not before King Wulfarth killed King Dumalakath, the dwarf orc, and doomed his people. Then Vek, the devil, blasted the Ash King into hell, and it was over. Later, Kine lifted the ashes of Ysmir into the sky, saving him from hell and showing her sons the colour of blood when it is brought by betrayal. And the Nords will never trust another devil again. This common retelling of Wulfarth's tale at Red Mountain is, in my opinion, the false one, if any are true at all. It is said that Dagoth tricked the Nords, and the Heart of Shor, aka the Heart of Lorkhan, was not in the Eastern Kingdoms at all, and we know from first-hand experience of the Elder Scrolls III Morrowind plotline that it was there, presumably since Auriel shot it into the sea with his bow, where Red Mountain would grow from. Its use was the instigating conflict of the Dwemer and the Kaima, and later it would be what the Tribunal would use to become living gods, and Azura would curse the Kaima people, turning them into the Dunmer for such betrayal. So, knowing that the fifth song of Wulfarth contradicts first-hand experience, let us read the secret song of Wulfarth Ash King. The Truth at Red Mountain. The Heart of Shor was in Resdayn as Dagoth had promised. As Shor's army approached the westernmost bank of the Inner Sea, they stared across at Red Mountain where the Dwemeri armies had gathered. News from scouts reported that the Chimeri forces had just left Narsis and that they were taking their time joining their cousins against the Nords. Dagoth said that the Tribunal had betrayed their king's trust, that they sent Dagoth to Lorkhan, for that is what they called Shor in Resdayn, so that the god might wreak vengeance on the dwarves for their hubris, that Nerevar's peace with the Dwemer would be the ruin of the Velothi way. This was the reason for the slow muster, Dagoth said. The armies grow, and Lorkhan, for that is what they called Shor in Resdayn, said, I do not wreak vengeance on the dwarves for the reasons that the Tribunal might believe I do. Nevertheless, it is true that they will die by my hand, and any whoever should side with them. This Nerevar is the son of Boethia, one of the strongest Padomaics. He is a hero to his people despite his tribunal, and he shall muster enough that this battle will be harder going still. We will need more than what we have. And so Dagoth who wanted the dwarves as dead as the tribunal did, went to Coggoran and summoned his House Chapthil, his Nixhounds, his wizards, archers, his stolen men of brass. And the Ash King Wulfarth hoary Ysmir went and made peace with the orcs in spite of his Nordic blood, and they brought many warriors but no wizards at all. Many Nords could not bring themselves to ally with their traditional enemies, even in the face of Red Mountain. They were close to desertion. Then Wulfarth said, Don't you see where you really are? Don't you know who Shor really is? Don't you know what this war is? And they looked from the king to the god to the devils and orcs, and some knew, really knew, and they are the ones that stayed. There is a lot of potential complexity and interpretation in all these passages, but in an already large video I'd like to summarize the last part succinctly with the interpretation that I agree with. When Wulfarth is saying, don't you see where you really are? Don't you know who Shor really is? Don't you know what this war is? He is referencing the dragon break that they are within, the Red Moment. The events of Red Mountain are considered to have taken part during a dragon break, and when the dragon breaks, time breaks, and it is like a return to the Dawn Era, where linear time is broken, contradictory events and outcomes all happening at once. Wulfarth is referencing this return to the Dawn Era. He is pointing out Shor as Lorkhan, pointing out how within this moment they are in some mythic sense reliving the battles at the dawn. A mythic reenactment almost. There is a far deeper breakdown to be had here, but I want to remain on course for now. The secret song continues. The Doom Drum. Nerevar carried Keening, a dagger made of the sound of the shadow of the moons. His champions were Dumak Dwarf King, who carried a hammer of divine mass, and Alandro Sul, who was the immortal son of Azura and wore the Wraith Mail. They met Lorkhan at the last battle of Red Mountain. Lorkhan had his heart again, but he had long been from it, and he needed time. Wulfarth met Sul, but could not strike him, and he fell from grievous wounds, but not before shouting Sul blind. Dagoth met Dumak and slew him, but not before Sunder struck his lord's heart. Nerevar turned away from Lorkhan and struck down Dagoth in rage, but he took a mortal wound from Lorkhan in turn. But Nerevar feigned the death that was coming early, and so struck Lorkhan with surprise on his side. The heart had been made solid by Sunder's turning blow, and Keening could now cut it out. And it was cut out, and Lorkhan was defeated, and the whole ordeal was thought over. Make of the secret song what you will. There are many loose connections and contrary interpretations to be made, but Wulfarth's legend does not end with this. Wulfarth fell, and his ashes returned to Skyrim, carried by the winds of Kine. In the aftermath of Red Mountain, there was one veteran who would change the fate of Nordic power, for better or for worse, and his name was Jurgen Windcaller.
He was a great war leader of the ancient Nords, a master of the voice, or tongue. After the disaster at Red Mountain, where the Nord army was annihilated, He spent many years pondering the meaning of that terrible defeat. He finally came to realize that the gods had punished the Nords for their arrogant and blasphemous misuse of the voice. He was the first to understand that the voice should be used solely for the glory and worship of the gods, not the glory of men. Jurgen Windcaller's mastery of the voice eventually overcame all opposition, and the way of the voice was born.
Jurgen was also called the Calm, who converted to a pacifist creed that denounced the use of the voice for martial exploits. His philosophy prevailed, largely due to his unshakable mastery of the voice. His victory was sealed in a legendary confrontation where the Calm is said to have swallowed the shouts of 17 tongues of the militant school for 3 days until his opponents all lay exhausted and then became his disciples. And so it was Jurgen Windcaller who, through his own mastery of the voice, brought an end to its use in war, and from this day forth, the days of the mighty tongue warlords were over. Nordic society would be quite different the next times Wulfarth the Ash King would re-enter the stage. While the Nordic Pantheon was still of worship, the conquering days of Nordic power were over, the most powerful tongues secluded and resigned to pacifist ways. Skyrim would remain steadfast through the fall of the Alessian Empire, the rise of the Riemann Empire and its fall in the Second Era, and they would, though divided into an Eastern and Western kingdom during the Interregnum, eventually be reunited. Enter the story of Talos. The orthodox story is that upon the far-off land of Atmoran, Talos was born, his name translating to Stormcrown, a curiously similar origin to Wulfarth. It seems there are many kings of Skyrim that hail from Atmoran. He went to Skyrim and learnt to use the thumb, and he studied the arts of war under chieftains. At 20, he led the invasion of Old Hroldan in the Reach and took it from the hands of the Witchmen. Growing storms beckoned the young Talos to High Hrothgar, and here the Greybeards removed their gags and spoke, shaking the world. They announced prophecy. Talos was to go south and unite all of Tamriel, for he was named Ysmir, Dragon of the North. He was dragonborn, and with the power of his thumb he inspired Skyrim's armies to his side, and he would be named Tiber Septim in Cyrodiil, and through his actions he would unite all of Tamriel and become the founding emperor of the Septim Empire. For his deeds in life, he apotheosized and became the 9th Divine. The Thalmor of today try and outlaw his worship, but the Stormcloaks in the east of Skyrim have turned their back on the Empire, for they will fight to the bitter end for their right to worship their god Talos. So while Talos is an imperial deity, one of the 9 divines, he, in conventional orthodoxy, has an intrinsic connection with the Nords. He was born of Atmora, spent his youth in Skyrim, had a powerful thumb, and was recognized as Ysmir, Dragon of the North, by the Greybeards, and so understandably, Nordic affinity for Talos makes sense. However, throughout the Third Era, he was known as Ysmir in their pantheon, but in time, as imperialization has occurred throughout the Fourth Era, Talos is the name he goes by in Skyrim. Interestingly, you may remember that High King Wulfarth was named Ysmir, Dragon of the North as well, and that it is a title of great honor in Skyrim. You as the last Dragonborn also get named Ysmir, but perhaps there is more than just a shared title between Wulfarth and Talos. The Arcturian heresy is just that, a heresy in the eyes of heterodoxy, one that speaks of a different version of events, one that claims that the miraculous powers of Talos to instead be the work of the Ash King Wulfarth, one that claims Tiber Septim was not Talos of Atmora, but a Breton, Hjalti Earlybeard from the Isle of Eclair. Again, we have made videos before going over the intricacies of this tale, but I will let the words speak for themselves. It is the rumbling of the Greybeards that wake him. Though the Empire has crumbled, there are rumors that a chosen one will come to restore it. This new emperor will defeat the elves and rule a united Tamriel. Naturally, Wulfarth thinks he is the figure of prophecy. He goes directly to High Hrothgar to hear the Greybeards speak. When they do, Ysmir is blasted to ash again. He is not the chosen one. It is a warrior youth from High Rock. As the Grey Wind goes to find this boy, he hears the Greybeard's warning, "Remember the color of betrayal, King Wulfarth." Hjalti was a shrewd tactician, and his small band of Colovian troops and Nord berserkers broke the Reachman line, forcing them back beyond the gates of Old Hroldan. A siege seemed impossible, as Hjalti could expect no reinforcements from Falkreath. That night, a storm came and visited Hjalti's camp. It spoke with him in his tent. At dawn, Hjalti went up to the gates, and the storm followed just above his head. Arrows could not penetrate the winds around him. He shouted down the walls of Old Roldan, and his men poured in. After their victory, the Nords called Hjalti Talos, or Storm Crown. The Arcturian heresy continues to tell of Ysmir Wulfarth, the Grey Wind, and his role in Hjalti's ascension as Tiber Septim, and his role as part of the Oversoul that would become Talos. But I'll link other resources and leave it to you to investigate. For now, we must return to the strangeness of the Nords, and there is one idea that I think is worth entertaining. The history of Skyrim has long been entangled with that of the Giants. For as long as the Nords have been in Skyrim, so have the Towering Giants. Volume 27 of the Songs of Return, written about the legend of Ysgramor, tell of his foe Sinmur, a legendary half-giant chieftain. The axe Wuthrad, dripping with the gore of 100 dead giants, gleamed in the darkness of Sinmur's barrow. Ysgramor strode forward, halting his followers with a gesture. With another he dared Sinmur to face him in mortal combat. The giant kin proved willing, roaring his defiance and leaping into battle. His massive iron-bound club swung forward to crush. Our Lord Ysgramor stepped aside, and the club shattered the stone a pace from his side. Wuthrad sang a blood song as it is chopped into the club, breaking it asunder as if made from straw. Sinmur howled his rage and hurled the stub of his once fearsome weapon at our Lord Ysgramor's head. He grappled Ysgramor, seeking to squeeze life away. A roar of laughter was the answer the monster received. Ysgramor's forehead and knee delivered 2 mighty blows. Sinmur screeched and fell to his knees before our Lord. A song of death and delight keened from Wuthrad as Ysgramor buried it deep in the giant kin's skull. A splatter of gore and a death rattle came from Sinmur as Ysgramor gave a victory yell. The companions cheered mightily as Wuthrad waved overhead. The depredations of the giants and his vile kin were at last ended, and the legend of Ysgramor, harbinger of us all, grew mightily that day. The giants thereafter were relegated to wander with their herds of mammoths, avoiding the proliferating societies of Nords, staying to their remote camps. But there is a source called Giants, a discourse, which speaks of a united heritage with the Nords. Cord the Curious, writer of the treatise, says, "But nonetheless we are connected to these giants, for we both share a common ancestor. The Atmorans were huge and smart. Nords descended from these ancient folk became the small, relatively speaking, intelligent people that we are today. Giants, on the other hand, became the huge, stupid creatures that we watch from a distance. Once we honored our cousins with offerings of cows, but this practice has fallen out of favor. Perhaps that is the detriment of Nord villages everywhere. Today, most Nords refuse to acknowledge the obvious connection between us and the giants. We treat the giants as nuisance, stealing their grazing lands and even hunt their mammoths for sport. This will be our undoing. To disrespect the giants is to disrespect ourselves. If we can't learn to live with our huge cousins, I fear that conflict could become all-out war, and that would be a shame." In the Elder Scrolls Legends card game, there is a depiction of an ancient giant, perhaps the very same ancient Atmorans that Cord is referring to, and he is shown to be as large as a mountain, many times more than the giants of today. Perhaps there is some truth to this theory. Perhaps the giants were part of earlier migrations to Skyrim, well before Ysgramor's return. Consider that the sea giants, active into the Second Era, were avid sailors and pirates. They hunt the northern seas for whales in their island-sized longships. They are both far more intelligent and violent than the giants of Skyrim's mainland, and certain tales claim they may be descendants of Atmoran titans, ancient giants that lived on Atmora. Perhaps long ago, Skyrim's giants were of similar intelligence as indicated by Sinmur and his clan. And interestingly, there have been cases, such as with Lyra's Titanborn, where they have been descended of giant admixture. We know from the Songs of Return that Sinmur himself was described as half-giant. Truly we are grasping at threads when trying to make some tapestry of a consistent mytho-historical origin, but it is an interesting possibility to ponder. Also, there is a sketch made by Michael Kirkbride, which shows Talos saying farewell to the king of Atmora, who appears as an enormous giant. Perhaps the Atmoran Titan King. Who knows? Well, was that weird enough for you? Elemental Nords of the far north and remote who carry the winds with them, painted in protective woad with roped tongues of enemies strung around their necks enchanted with speech, flying snow whales that spout coke, warriors that have no need of siege engines and need only to shout the walls down, kings that could swallow clouds, and chieftains who could make risen thralls of chewed mud or could make the skies sick and have them rain bile. And think too of their possible origins, born of Kind's breath, or perhaps the descendants of Atmoran titans, worshipping animal totems for as long as they can remember. Personally, I love the weirder lore of the Elder Scrolls. It's what's drawn me in deeper and deeper into this universe. And I hope you do as well. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey. I'd love to hear your thoughts and theories in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching, and another thank you to our sponsor, Raid Shadow Legends. You can click the link in the description or scan my QR code to get all those bonuses for new players, including an epic champion. My name is Scott, and I'll be back to nerd out with you again next time.